Welcome to the Introduction to Chinese Politics course. This course provides an introduction to the recent political developments, institutional partnerships, state-society relationships, and the global engagement of political actors in contemporary China. It will consider a number of approaches for conceptualizing, modeling, and analyzing the governance and politics of China, utilizing a comparative perspective. To understand China's modernization efforts, we must consider it as a process of change. It is a process of transformation from a traditional agricultural society to a modern industrial one. In fact, we can go back as far as 1919, during the May 4th movement, when intellectuals expressed a hope of modernizing China from this traditional agricultural society to a modern industrial society. Modernization from this point became a modus operandi until Japan occupied China and into the early parts of China's post-1949 history. In the 1970s, the Communist Party of China, or the CPC, sought to realize the four modernizations in the fields of industry, agriculture, national defense, and science and technology. Essentially, at the end of the Cultural Revolution, the concept of modernization became a slogan, and it became a task to be achieved. Today, the theory of modernization applied to China gives thought to the dualism between tradition and modernity. In effect, there's a movement towards bringing modernity to China, which is reflected in the nation's development efforts. To understand China's modernization project, we must go back to the 1840s, where this is really the start and the beginning of China's modernization. During this period, the aim was to save the nation from Western invasion. After being defeated by Western powers, China began to realize that in order to defeat the West and to make the country stronger, the main solution was to learn from the West. The existing Qing dynasty thus decided to launch a reform and began to develop industry and technology. During this period, the Qing built many factories according to Western models, and they did so in a very short period. This is also referred to as the Yang Wu movement. The second major period in China's modernization project was between 1911 and 1949. During this period of modernization, there was a change from a federal dynasty system to a bourgeois revolution. The Qing dynasty had adopted Western technology and developed industry during the first period of modernization. Yet China's navy was defeated by Japan in 1894 to 1895 in the Chinese North Sea. This failure was a great shock to China. How could a large nation that had been developing for 50 years be defeated by a small island nation? One of the reasons for this reality is that the Qing dynasty had only carried out reforms within the federal dynasty system, while the reformers did not really want to change the ancient regime. Defeat against the Japanese had shown that it was impossible to make China strong under the ancient regime, and that the Qing dynasty could not lead the way to modernization. Revolution was thus an absolute necessity. In 1911, Sun Yat-sen, led a Qinghai revolution movement and overthrew the Manchu Empire, proclaimed the Republic of China, and organized elections for the first parliament in the history of China. Although the social structure did not change, this political revolution altered the direction of China's modernization. This was a reform of the political system, founding a modern political system adapted from the French and American republic system. This also marked China's entry into the modern capitalistic society. After constructing a new political system, the Kuomintang attempted to build the state by introducing a modern system of economy, finance, foreign trade, and establishing a stock exchange following Western models. China's economy not only recovered, but also grew from 1912 to 1937. In 1937, however, Japan invaded China, which abruptly broke the process of economic growth for 8 years. Had it not been for the 8 long years of war against Japan from 1937 to 1945, many scholars ask, would China have achieved an economic growth comparable to that of an industrialized nation? Irrespective, after war against Japan came another 3 years of civil war from 1946 to 1949, in which two parties, the Kuomintang and the Communist Party, fought. And in the end, the communists won the war, and a new nation was founded based on the working class and the peasants, as opposed to the Kuomintang's reliance on the bourgeois or the capitalist class. This also meant that China recovered national unity and sovereignty for the first time since 1840. The third major period in China's path to modernization occurred between 1949 and 1978. This period is marked by capitalistic to socialistic modernization. After China's civil war, the new leaders faced a difficult situation. China was still a poor and relatively backward nation, although its industry had developed since the middle of the 19th century. There was no industrial revolution such as that in the United Kingdom, and if there were signs of modernity, it was limited to cities such as Shanghai. Economic development became the first task for the new China. At that time, the communist leadership dropped the Western model and opted for the Soviet model of development. The former is characterized by reliance on the market economy, the latter by the creation of a centrally directed planned economy, by a strategy of high-speed industrialization with priority given to heavy industry, and by a series of radical social reforms, political and literary purges. Yet history was to prove that the Soviet model had serious shortcomings. It idealized a centrally directed planned economy, it mistakenly regarded market economy as necessarily capitalistic, and it abolished private property. At that same time, in order to realize socialist modernization, Mao Zedong favored a revolutionary or more radical way during the Great Leap Forward. He ordered the organization of peasants into people's communes. He called on the industrial workers to increase steel production by all possible means, including the most primitive. In the intellectual field, he struck down many intellectuals after labeling them as bourgeois factions. In 1966, Mao decided to launch the Great Proletariat Cultural Revolution. This movement lasted for 10 years, from 1966 to 1976. During the Cultural Revolution, instead of revolution and socialism, people lived under the reign of terror. The nation was in complete disorder, production slowed down, and the national economy came to the brink of bankruptcy. All traditional values were derided and thrown overboard. In September 1976, when Chairman Mao died and Deng Xiaoping came to power, he proclaimed the end of the Cultural Revolution. This marked the end of the socialist model of modernization. In the most recent period of modernization, the facts had shown that Mao's socialist modernization or anti-capitalistic modernization had little to no desirable results. Deng Xiaoping thus took steps to reform the regime. He called for the liberation of the mind from old dogmas and a mistaken understanding of socialism. These included the belief that a centrally planned economy was parallel with socialism, that a market economy is by nature capitalistic, that nationalized and collective enterprises are naturally superior to private ownership, that class struggle becomes more acute as society advances. In December 1976, during the third plenum of the 11th Congress, Deng declared that China was through with revolution and that it would carry out a policy of reform and opening up. Economic development and modernization were the key priorities. China has changed greatly since that time. A market economic system has been founded, the economy has grown, state-owned enterprises coexist with other forms of ownership, namely collective, private, and mixed ownership structures. science and education are given attention as basic means towards national revival. While it appears I summarized the course in a very brief period here, if it was only that simple, we would not need the course. What has become evident is that there are a variety of controversies about what we can learn from the Chinese Revolution. Moreover, there are passionate discussions about China's current march to modernization in the market reform era. We will discuss in the next few slides 5 lessons learned from China's revolution, and throughout the course we will converse and debate about China's current modernization project. One of the first lessons we can distill from China's path to modernization is that the Kuominta's rule was as much the precursor of the Chinese Revolution as its political enemy. The Kuomintang is seen to be trapped in a conservative political culture, defending the force of tradition and abandoning workers and peasants to their miserable fates. Its leaders were inspired by both fascism and Confucianism. In effect, the CPC did not only rise to power as the dialectic opposite of the Kuomintang. There were important points of unity in areas where the Kuomintang paved the way for the communists, where the latter built on the foundations laid by the former. In fact, many activists joined both parties during the 1920s. Memories and friendships from the first Kuomintang-CPC collaboration were never erased at the local level. Millions of Chinese rallied to the CPC during the war against Japan, in part because the communists seemed to be the proper ears of the revolutionary anti-imperialism of Sun Yat-sen's party during the 1920s. In effect, they seemed better to embody the nationalistic rhetoric of the Kuomintang's propaganda and public school textbooks than did the Kuomintang itself. The second lesson learned is the fact that the revolution was not a liberation, but for most was the replacement of one form of domination with another. In rethinking the Chinese Revolution, we must rethink the analytical baggage that comes with the term revolution. As a historical metaphor, the term revolution has, since the French Revolution, been associated with liberty. Most Marxist historiographers has taken France as the original model for revolution, and seen revolution as bringing liberation from the oppressive constraints of the old regime. The Chinese communists themselves built on this implied meaning by calling their revolution a liberation. Much of our own scholarship has accepted this conceptualization, as we have studied Chinese struggles for liberation from imperialistic domination, peasants' and workers' struggles for freedom from landlords' or employers' exploitation, and of course women's struggles to escape the bondage of patriarchy. Whereas we should not deny that the revolution was fueled by the efforts of millions of Chinese actors to escape some form of oppression, we should also realize that there were probably an even greater number of Chinese who experienced a revolution as a replacement of one form of domination with another. Most Chinese citizens did not experience the success of the revolution and the coming power of the CPC as some form of personal liberation. The PRC ushered in a better world in part because the CPC brought order and discipline to their environment, and this was probably as important to many as was any sense of liberation. In the countryside, peasants demanded above all that the new regime be fair, and the party made tremendous efforts in rectification campaigns to ensure that cadres not be guilty of favoritism, that they take the lead in making sacrifices, that they take the lead simply living free of corruption, and that they ensure that the burdens of revolutionary struggle were borne equitably. Thus, peasants were highly approving of party efforts to force idlers and paupers into productive work. In short, it is difficult to see the revolution as any sort of liberation of the poor, but the measures were welcome because they were perceived as a discipline that was fair, that would allow to have honest living work like everyone else. For example, given the tight PRC controls over employment, residence, education, culture, political activity, and even biological reproduction, If one views the revolution as liberation, then one must view the post-revolutionary regime as a betrayal. Yet few Chinese citizens saw it that way, and I would suggest that such a, quote, betrayal theory is ill-founded. It makes far more sense to recognize that the revolution was not so much a process of liberation as a process wherein a new structure of domination was created to do battle with, to defeat, and to replace another structure of domination. In this process, the communists certainly empowered new actors and mobilized new social constituencies. They also broke down all structures of domination, eliminating them, expelling, humiliating, and intimidating old elites. The third lesson learned is the fact that the large structures of China's state and society did not make revolution inevitable, but they imposed significant constraints on the agents of revolution and counter-revolution. The larger socioeconomic structures played a major role in fostering the revolution. China's largely agrarian but highly commercialized economy, its relatively weak and dependent bourgeois, and its centralized bureaucratic political systems were related to its modern revolutionary experience. The apparent strength of the late imperial state prior to the 19th century lay in the absence of powerful rivals, either domestic or foreign. The Chinese landed elite, lacking judicial or military functions and weakened economically by the practice of partible inheritance, was a much smaller threat to central authority than were any of the European aristocracies. Internationally, the late imperial state was not seriously threatened prior to the arrival of the West. Precisely because it had no rivals, the Chinese imperial state was quite weak by world standards. It commanded an extraordinarily small portion of national revenues. The land tax, which was the basis of state finance, took only 5 to 6% of the harvest, against, in comparison to Japan, 30 to 40%. Low tax rates meant that, in comparative terms, the state's burden on the peasantry was quite light. In addition, the practice of partible inheritance restrained land concentration so that most peasants were guaranteed access to at least a small plot of land. These barriers to complete pauperization, plus the access to wage or petty trade incomes afforded by China's highly commercialized rural economy, and the efficient safety net provided by the centralized Qing state famine relief measures, lay behind China's enormous population increase during the late imperial period. These characteristics of China's political economy meant that during the modern era, China confronted the West and Japan with a weak state and an enormous population. The modern Chinese state was never able to control anything like the Meiji state's hefty proportion of the agricultural product, in part because population had now grown to an extent that even marginal tax increases were seen by peasants as subsistent threats and provoked violent resistance. In consequence, the weak and impoverished Chinese state was humiliated repeatedly by the foreign powers, and the massive indemnities of the Sino-Japanese War and the Boxer Protocol meant that just as China roused itself to a major state-building effort with the late Qing reforms, it was further drained of potential revenues. The key byproduct of China's social structure and political economy was the weak Chinese state. Unable to protect the Chinese nation during an age of imperialism, the late Qing and Republican states were constantly criticized and challenged by nationalist rivals in the urban classes and civil and military elites. Unable to penetrate or bring the benefits of modernization to peripheral and backward areas of the nation, the state left a vast hitherland where the communists were able to organize those left out of the fragile modernization process. The fourth lesson learned is the idea that revolution is a process. When the 1911 revolution left China without a strong central government or any elite consensus about what a legitimate government might look like, the way was left open for the Kuomintang to reorganize and revitalize itself as a claimant to national leadership. During the 1920s, with the advice and assistance of the Soviet Union, the reorganized Kuomintang established some of the fundamental contours of 20th century Chinese politics. For instance, Leninist Party organization, a party army with political officers binding the military to the party's political agenda. Party-directed mass organization of students, workers, and peasants with nationalistic and socialist reformist agendas. Political rituals involving public celebrations of obedience to the national leader and the creation of a new citizenry. And finally, a revolutionary discourse that stigmatized opponents as counter-revolutionary agents of imperialism and feudal reaction. Among students and intellectuals, the Kuomintang's nationalist and socialist reformist agenda attracted growing support. But in part because the foreign and conservative Chinese press stressed the role of Russian aid and Bolshevik advisors in the movement, the Kuomintang's Chinese communist allies shared in support garnered by the National Revolution. In consequence, when Jiang Jieshi purged the communists in 1927, although his short-term success was complete, he created the impression among many that he had betrayed the revolutionary legacy of Sun Zhongshan. The communists were able to claim that they were the true heirs to the revolutionary tradition of the 1920s. Driven from the cities and forced into the hinterlands in 1927, the revolution first required military forces. They were usually in the first instance defectors from the Kuomintang armies, or more accurately, men who saw the Kuomintang betraying the revolution in 1927, or later in their failures to resist Japan. Second, civil adherents to the revolution worked through established elite networks to establish the basis for revolutionary action. Third, bandits, secret society members, and a variety of discontented individuals were recruited to join the initial Red Army units and form small but powerful guerrilla bands in isolated peripheral areas. These initial guerrilla bands represented a minuscule portion of the rural population. At this stage, there was nothing resembling mass mobilization. However, by selective and just violence against hated state agents and cruel landlord and militia elites, they managed to eliminate or neutralize their potential political opponents. Once this was done, they could spread propaganda, recruit more broadly into the party, organize mass organizations, and eventually abolish the old tax regime and carry out land reform, or during the War of Resistance, rent and interest reduction and progressive tax reform. As successful as these efforts were, they could not have succeeded without the war with Japan. Economic development and the Kuomintang state-building efforts were proceeding well enough along the coast and in economic core areas so that the nationalists were able to contain the communist appeal to peripheral zones. As Japanese aggression intensified following their 1931 occupation of the Northeast, Jiang Jieshi and the Nanjing government lost political support in urban areas. But there was no urban opposition strong or cohesive enough to pose an alternative. Once full-scale war with Japan broke out in 1937, however, the rapid retreat of Kuomintang officials and regular army units from North China left rural elites and former warlord forces to contend with the communists and Japanese on their own. In this situation, a small number of factors favored the communists. Many local communists had contacts going back to the 1920s to establish their local credibility. Most of these had superior nationalistic credentials to the Kuomintang rivals, who had defended Jiang's attempts to appease the Japanese aggressors. Years in the political wilderness made these communist leaders more capable of accepting the hardships of partisan warfare, and both their egalitarian ideology and their years of struggle led them to enforce a severely Spartan lifestyle on all full-time political cadres and military officers. In the context of war with Japan, the new Communist Party state built support for a program of shared sacrifice in which the burden of progressive taxation and rent and interest reduction fell heavily on the elite. But in large measures because the regime's leaders could demonstrate that they were not benefiting materially from these new burdens, Their sort of demands were regarded as fair by the rural population, and fairness was all that was required. These factors allowed the CPC to establish a number of reasonable, stable bases in North and Central China. Finally, the fifth lesson learned is understanding the state-building activities of the Chinese Revolution. The Qing state had approximately 750,000 functionaries, or one for every 600 people, whereas the PRC had 5.3 million cadres in 1952 and 29 million cadres in 1988, or one for every 35 citizens. It is clear that state building was a central facet of the Chinese Revolution. A critical appeal to the new party state was the selfless dedication of its cadres. Clearly, once the party's monopoly of power, together with the spread of a market economy, made corruption and abuse of privilege commonplace during the 1980s, the revolutionary era was over, and the revolution's own legitimacy was called into question. Nothing in the revolutionary process suggested popular support for an economic program that went beyond small peasant farming, private and voluntary cooperative ownership, and free market economy. Seen in this way, it becomes easier to understand both the pervasive influence of the Chinese state and the current enthusiasm for market reforms. And if we understand the political demands behind the Chinese Revolution to be for fairness and order, far more than democracy and liberation, it becomes easier to understand both the crisis of 1989 and the current resilience of the authoritarian state in China. Modern Chinese history has been dominated and distorted by a theology of revolution. All history is seen as leading up to 1949. Economic history analyzed the weakness of Chinese capitalism. Rural society and peasant uprisings were studied to understand the roots of peasant revolution. Mind you, the year 1949 was not the end of China's history. Indeed, within a few years, the era of revolutionary socialism may appear as much a transitional period as the Republican era. The critical political process in modern China is state building. Founded on popular support gained through the revolutionary process, consolidated by organizational efficacy of the Leninist Party state, inspired by nationalist pride in a new China, and supported by new technologies of violence, communications, surveillance, and medicine, the contemporary Chinese state has brought unprecedented discipline and control over the lives of Chinese citizens. The Kuomintang communist conflict was in part the struggle between the modernized, overseas connected coastal zones and the depressed and forgotten rural interior. The gap between coastal prosperity and interior poverty helped free the revolution, was checked by a planned economy of the early PRC, and is now regaining salience with the return of the market economy. In the past, it has always been the powerful unifying forces of state power and official culture that has held such regional disparities and tensions in check. The state is now surely stronger than any pre-revolutionary government. In the series of lectures, we will follow China's path to modernization in the post-market reform era. However, as this lecture demonstrates, and it may be cliché but yet true to say this, to fully understand China's current modernization efforts, we must appreciate the nation's past. This concludes our lecture on the path to modernization. In our next lecture, we will look at the onset of reforms.